of a marriage in crisis, a violent marriage. And that voice kind of came to me from somewhere, and the paragraph that opens the book with this bird speaking in this quite articulate, quite poetic voice is the first part of the book that I heard. It doesn't usually work that way, that what comes to me first ends up being the first lines, but it did with that book. In thinking about origins, though, it's not just voice, it's all these elements from the world around me that present themselves to me. And for me, it's a matter of staying receptive and staying curious to those elements as they rush past me and recognising which ones belong in my work. And often I will tuck details away for sometimes decades before they return to me, or I'm looking back through my notes and all those little scraps of paper that I've kept, and I realise, oh, that's right, that's why I kept that thing. It's because it belongs in this book. So an example of that is the title, The Axeman's Carnival, which refers to competitive wood chopping events in New Zealand where strong, manly New Zealand men chop wood with axes competitively. And these events still happen around New Zealand. And in 2008, I was visiting a tiny museum in the South Island in New Zealand and saw historical photographs of this event, the Axeman's Carnival. And I thought, that's a great title for a book. I don't know what book, but I know somehow it belongs to my work and I want to write that book one day. So years later, when I was thinking about what will my next book be, and thinking about wanting to write something that had an unusual narrator, because I like to set myself challenges, I was thinking, well, perhaps an animal. I haven't written from the point of view of an animal before. Maybe I could try that. And I was thinking for several months about what sort of animal it could be. I was thinking dogs. I was thinking wolves for a while. And then I realised every morning for those 3 months, I would go to my writing room at home and open the window, and in would pour this fluting, melodious song of the magpies, which are, in New Zealand are a different species from the crow family. They're very beautiful songbirds. And I realised that my narrator was there the whole time and had been calling to me the whole time saying, we're just here, we're just outside the window, put us in your book. So that's how I came up with the narrator. And then by some mysterious process that I don't want to interrogate too hard because it seems slightly magical to me, I remembered that title, The Axeman's Carnival, and I thought, well, magpies are associated with the rural parts of New Zealand. The Axeman's Carnival seems to suggest a rural story about masculinity and potentially violence. There's kind of a dark undercurrent to that title. I think these two things belong together. So that's quite typical for how my books come together, is by sort of piecing together those little scraps that I've kept and realising which bit belongs with which other bit.
One of my trysts with these little scraps, the oddest one I had was when I was actually, normally for a novel, it's for me, it's an image that refuses to let go, or it's a voice, as you say, which starts talking to you in your head quite alarmingly at times. But there's this Sri Lankan writer called Shehan Karunatilake, who is an eminent Sri Lankan writer, but he also worked in advertising before. And he asked me to write a little story of just a few hundred words, not even that, to print in invisible ink onto a wrapping for a tea bag. And he said the idea of this campaign was that when you dipped the tea bag into the tea and then you held it above in the steam, the words would appear of the story. And then as you drank your tea and the paper dried again, the words would disappear. So you were writing something, and this was the first time I was sort of writing anything fictional to order. I had never, but this this really appealed to me because it seemed to echo the, this magic you were talking about, the kind of appearance and disappearance of the story. Sometimes you dream of it at night and then it's gone by the morning. So I wrote a story in which a woman was making jasmine tea and drinking it. And as she drank the tea, there was a picture in her room of the Mattie's picture of the nudes dancing on grass. And she had this ability to enter the picture after drinking that tea. And she became one of those completely uninhibited dancers on the grass. And when her husband came home early one day, he couldn't find his wife, but didn't notice that she was inside that picture. And this made me feel that this story I had was about the really parallel lives writers mostly live, in which one part of your life is completely secret. You can't talk about it because you lose it. So you are living this very intense secret life at all times, and you are trying to live the normal life as well. And this is what this woman was doing in the story, that she was going. And then this little scrap I had written for the tea bag became the start of my one of my books called All the Lives We Never Lived, in which a child has the ability to imaginatively enter pictures. So that's slightly, I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. Catherine, you go.
I love what you say about the secrecy of a writer's life and our craft. I know for me, when I'm writing a story and I'm really excited about it, there is that danger in sharing it too early before it's fully kind of crystallized in your mind, because as you say, it may all disappear. But I wonder if you also feel the way I do, which is knowing that there has to come a time when the work is no longer secret. And that feels like quite a vulnerable time somehow, that you're sending this creation of yours off to other eyes. And sometimes I feel quite reluctant to do that. Like I would like to keep the secret just for myself.
Absolutely. I often feel as if I even talk about it to completely sympathetic friends or, people who read my work, as if once I've told them what it's about, then I don't need to write it anymore. It just loses, something gets sucked out of it. And then when the time does come to share a draft, that is, as you say, when you're waiting for the first person who is going to read the draft to read it and respond, it's a horrible time. However many books you write, it is still a horrible time.
Actually, one thing that is a secret, so perhaps I shouldn't share it with you, but one trick that I've done with all of my books over the years is to include some little details and little codes that mean something to me but won't mean anything to anyone else. And it's a way of kind of retaining ownership of it when it is going to be such public property.
I do exactly
so
the
you know
same
what
thing.
I mean?
Yeah.
So for me, they look like, if there's a random date that I have to include in the novel, I'll use
I
my
do that
dad's
all
birthday, for instance, or my parents' wedding anniversary, or a date that has meaning only to me and possibly my sister. Yeah.
Yes,
You do that too?
I do that too. And when if I ever go back to my own book and reread it, and I spot that, and it's that little thing which is still only mine, because otherwise it's a peculiar process to be read, because the first person who reads me is my partner. Not only because he is my partner, but because he is a publisher and an editor himself, and he's somebody who will be ruthlessly honest with me, which I want. But when I've given him the manuscript to read, and he puts it aside, for weeks I've thought, I'm plucking up the courage to give it to him. Finally, I've given it to him. And then I sort of what are you reading in that, on his laptop? So he'd say, I'm working on something else, I'll read it later. And then it's terrible, and it never gets any easier, the whole thing.
Thank you for those insights into where the creative spark comes from, how it's crystallized, ideated. I guess my next question is, as the process goes on, are there any particular parts of the process you find difficult? And particularly, I think a lot of writers oddly perhaps find ending a work challenging. Like, when do you know it's finished? Yeah.
For me, the hardest part, and that's why I was full of admiration for your Axeman's Carnival. I seem to spend the longest time trying to figure out what voice to write in. Because either the voice comes to you completely on its own, and then you can't fight it. It has to be written in that voice. But very often I find that's not the case, and I'm really struggling to, third person, second person, first person. So Catherine's book, Axeman's Carnival, when I read the blurb and it said it's written in the voice of a magpie, I thought, wait, how is this going to work? And then when you begin to read that book, it's just astonishing what she's done, because through this little fledgling that a woman finds and wants to, from the first page, you feel such a sense of vulnerability in the woman, in that little fledgling, and you are invested in the bird and the woman who is looking after the bird from the first page. And I thought it must have been such an incredibly challenging thing to do, to write a novel as a bird.
Yes, it was. I knew that I was taking a risk in that it would be quite easy to make it quite cute. And I wanted to avoid cuteness, absolutely avoid cuteness. It's quite a dark story, in fact. In many ways, it's the story of a violent marriage, but viewed through the lens of this bird who kind of has no understanding of the human world. So for me, I guess I came at it from the point of view of looking at the human world through fresh eyes and sort of turning it around to study human behaviour and the dark side of human behaviour from an unexpected point of view. I loved writing that book. I still catch myself thinking, so the bird is called Tama. I still catch myself thinking, I wonder what Tama's doing. And then I realise, oh, actually, you made him up, Catherine. He's in your head. He's not doing anything. But in terms of...
Can I ask you, did you actually open a Twitter account for the bird? In the book, the bird has a Twitter account.
Yes. So, Twitter is now X, but when I was writing the book and when it was published, it was still Twitter. And I thought, so one thing that happens in the book is that Marnie, the woman who rescues the bird, starts posting videos and photos of him online because it's kind of the one positive thing in her life. And he becomes an internet sensation. He learns how to talk and he goes viral and starts to potentially earn them enough money to save their failing farm and therefore to improve her husband's general mood so that he won't be the violent man that he's become. That's her hope. But when I was reading the proofs, I realised that I mentioned Tama's Twitter handle at one point, Tama Magpie, and I thought, well, if there's one reader who goes looking for that, I want them to find Tama on social media. So yeah, he exists. He posts quite regularly. Thinking about voice, though, and getting voice right, it's something that you do so beautifully in All the Lives We Never Lived. And I absolutely loved, and I don't think this is a spoiler, I loved the switch to the mother's voice that comes through in her letters much later in the book. And I wondered if you could talk about the decision to make that change quite late and how you navigated that artistic challenge.
Yes, it comes in right at the end that his mother is writing letters to her best friend, and he starts to read these letters. And I did think whether I should intersperse the narrative with those letters, but I really wanted it to be a whole section on its own, and because she's writing the letters from Bali in the sort of late 1930s, early 1940s to her best friend. And until then, I had been writing in the voice of Mishkin, who is her son and who's an older Indian man. So to really prepare for writing, because I really love I love narration through letters, because you sort of get the narrative in real time, because the character does not know nobody knows. It's written like a diary in the present day. And it's conversational, it's intimate because it's between two people. So I really, immersed myself in the memoirs and diaries of that time. And letters, the letters of Virginia Woolf, for example, and other writers of letters in the 30s, to get the particular inflections of language, the slang, the tones, and then I really locked myself up and wrote that whole section at one go.
I found it very moving, actually, and I admire your decision not to intersperse them throughout the text, but to have this voice suddenly hit us for a sustained period in the book, because this is the voice that's been absent for most of the book, and this is the voice of the mother that Mishkin has been longing for. And then suddenly we, the reader, experience what he does, which is this kind of barrage of her voice. Yeah. But to answer Matthew's question, which I've kind of veered away from, what's hard and how do you know when it's finished? It's all hard. It's all hard. I think I love the initial rush where anything could happen and the story could take you anywhere. And when it still is just fizzing in my head, when I actually sit down to write it, you have to be prepared to stick with a project when that initial fairy dust wears off and you realise it's no longer going to be that perfect, shining, sort of carved from crystal, beautiful object that I envisioned. In terms of knowing when to finish, when you find that you are putting back in the commas that you have already taken out, that's time to step away.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I find that I'm also, I'm fairly ruthless with deleting. I mean, I start disliking what I've written, so I begin to delete whole chunks. And then when I find I'm scrabbling to find those again and put them back in and put back sentences I've removed, then I know the book is over. And yet the ending, just a little while ago, somebody was asking me about the ending of one of my books, which was a fairly open-ended ending. And it's always a puzzle I work towards an ending. Like, I remember reading something by Penelope Fitzgerald, the British writer, who said that when she began any book of hers, she needed to know the first paragraph and the last paragraph and the title, and she didn't plan anything else, but she needed to know the ending. And different writers obviously have different approaches, and I feel like I need to have a sense of where the book is headed, but if I know the ending from the start, I don't feel interested enough to reach it. I feel I have to find the ending as I am writing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I always know the kind of emotional flavour of the ending. I know that from the start. And I don't wait until the end of the writing process to write the ending. I often write it maybe a third of the way in or halfway in. But it's often something that I'll look forward to writing. It feels like that's the reward when you get to write the ending. So often I'll delay writing it until I have the harder stuff out of the way.
Have you ever had anyone tell you to change the ending? I mean, from your publisher?
No, I did have my New Zealand publisher wanted me, it was in Remote Sympathy actually, which is a novel that I wrote set in Nazi Germany. And in that book, my New Zealand publisher wanted me to reveal the thing that's revealed at the end of the book up front, which would have completely defused the tension in it. And I couldn't understand his decision, so I resisted that, and he later agreed that he didn't know what he'd been thinking at all, and he'd been completely wrong, and it was far better to save that reveal.
Great. Thank you both for those insights. This is probably a good opportunity now for us to hear some of the fruits of that process. So if I could ask both of our authors to give a short reading from one of their works to give us an idea of where that process of creation, ideation, and the hard graft of writing, sort of the finished product of that.
Shall I read from the podium or here?
Oh, just read
Just
here probably,
yeah.
so if it was
Just
easier.
here. I promise this is from an actual book. It's Remote Sympathy, which is quite a big book, so I didn't bring it in my suitcase. So, as I said, it's set during Nazi Germany, and it tells the story of Leonard, who is a doctor with Jewish ancestry, but he does not, he wouldn't call himself Jewish, who in the early 1930s begins to think about inventing a machine that he believes will cure cancer. So a machine that works on electrotherapy, and he calls it the sympathetic vitalizer, and he thinks that he's going to save the world with this machine. But after some trials, it doesn't really produce any significant results, so he shelves it. Then about a decade later, in the early 1940s, he is brought as a prisoner to Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany at the orders of an SS officer whose wife has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And this SS officer strikes up this devil's covenant, really, with Leonard, the doctor. So the officer says to Leonard, if you rebuild your machine, and if you save my wife, I will ensure that you survive and that your family survives. So the doctor is in this impossible position where he believes that the machine doesn't work, but he knows that he has to convince this officer and his wife that it does work and that she will be cured. So this is quite near the start of the book, and Leonard is remembering how he came to research and build this machine. And he's remembering going to an exhibition that showed a figure called the Transparent Man, which was a human-sized transparent figure that stood with his arms raised, looking up towards the sky. And this was a real figure that was exhibited at a museum in Dresden, and he was an absolute sensation when he was shown. And I really loved that as a symbol for the book, as a way of thinking about looking inside ourselves and seeing what makes us tick. So, in the book Leonard is writing to his daughter Lotta, who he is separated from when he's in prison, and that's probably all you need to know. Despite my rush, once I reached the exhibition hall, I lingered in the tuberculosis room and the cancer room and the primitive races room. I took my time over the mechanical model of the heart. I delayed visiting the very thing I'd come to see, worried that it might disappoint. I suspect you'd understand that feeling, Lotta. I suspect you inherited my twisting anxieties, though I always hoped you'd be your mother's tranquil daughter. When finally I made my way to the room that held the transparent man, I was surprised to feel the tug of tears. I had not expected him to be so beautiful. He stood on his circular plinth, his clear arms raised, his chest laid bare, plastic organs lit in turn by tiny bulbs, every nerve pathway and every blood vessel on show. I followed the branching networks of wire and imagined the waves from my machine passing along them until they hit the tumour they were calculated to destroy, and I felt a great surge running through my own body. What if it worked? What if the sympathetic vitalizer worked? It really might save the world. It was all I could do to keep still, to keep quiet. In the other rooms, in front of the other exhibits, the crowds chattered away in their usual voices. But here, before the naked figure, they whispered as if in a church, even the sniggering schoolboys, even the blushing fiancés. And indeed, he stood in a kind of apse, a kind of chapel, shining beneath a pointed archway, lit only from overhead in the otherwise darkened space. Like an angel, a young woman next to me murmured. Her companion said he couldn't see any robes and he couldn't see any wings, but I knew what she meant. The figure shimmered above us, seeming to float in the shadows, a creature of water, a creature of light, like us, but not us, like us, but perfect.
Thank you, Catherine. Anuradha?
I'll read you a little portion from my last novel, which is called The Earth Spinner, which is about two potters and a dog. Dawn. The windows are down, and a dog hangs half out of the car, ears in flight, nose high in the air, gobbling the world with each breath. The woman has her eyes on the road, hands on the wheel. The man looks over his shoulder, murmuring words that make the dog so frantic with love that he musters all the strength in his body to clamber over to the front seat. He sits on the man's lap, fixing his solemn gaze on the road. His coat is black and brown, his eyebrows chestnut. Space expands, the horizon recedes. In the slow blooming light, adventurers in trucks, jeeps, cars have given the city the slip. Grey blue skies, diesel air, pylons topless in the mist. Bands of laboring cyclists they leave behind, men squatting behind bushes, ragged purple morning glory, far-eyed cows lost in thought. The woman presses down on the accelerator, thrusting all of that into the past. They talk. At times, their hands reach out for each other across the seat, and after a while, soothed by the rhythm of the drive and their voices, the dog retreats again to the back. Giant boulders stranded in the fields, huts you cannot tell apart from the mud, circles of sky trapped in puddles, trees, trees, trees. The man is driving now, and the dog begins to paw him and whine. Overhead is a green cathedral roof, and whatever light remains is sieved by the leaves. Though the city they are speeding towards is not far now, it does not feel that way on this road winding through stands of charred gum trees. Their trunks are black with soot, upper halves pale, jade leaves glowing. The dog paws the man again, more urgently. The man pulls over, throws back his head, closes for a moment his eyes that are bloodshot with staring into the sun. The woman springs out of the car with the dog on a lead. "Don't go far," the man says. He can see dim lights from a hamlet in the distance. His eyes follow the woman who is urging the dog to hurry, but the dog, now in search of a scent, tugs at his lead and goes further into the woods. The woman's voice fades and bird calls fill the emptied space. Half light fills the place with shadows as the woman turns back towards the road. But through gaps in the trees, she makes out two men, leaning in through the driver's window of their car. It must be that they are asking for directions. And yet, her heart turns into an iron ball slamming against her ribs. She sees the door open on the passenger side. In her nightmares, she has been here often. She starts to run without movement, getting no closer to the car. She shouts, but her throat produces no sound. The car's door bangs shut.
Thank you, Anuradha, and thank you both for those for those readings. And so, from readings from two of your acclaimed works, I understand that you both have works coming out this year as well. Would you be able to share with the audience some little teasers, perhaps, or some descriptions of what your upcoming books might be? Anuradha?
Well, I am actually coming out with my first work of non-fiction this year, which will be published in November. And it's a book about, I've been living in the mountains of Uttarakhand in a small town called Ranikhet for the past 25 years. And this book is really about Ranikhet as well as about the mountains surrounding it. I mean, it's about what it is for people from a city to leave. I had always lived in a city until the time I moved here. And it's really about, it's not a memoir, but it's about living away from a city, about working, writing life in the city, away from people who read, away from bookshops. There are no bookshops in my town. And we run a publishing house from there. And we live largely among people who are rural people. So that's what it's about. And I also am a painter and potter, so the book will be illustrated. So I'm quite excited about it.
Are you worried that everyone will want to move there once you publish the book?
That is definitely a worry, yes. Yeah.
And so my 9th novel is due out in May. Matthew mentioned it briefly in his introduction. It's called The Book of Guilt, and it is my first foray into dystopian fiction. Like I said, I like to challenge myself with each new book, so this is what I'm trying with this novel. It's set in a slightly skewed version of Britain in 1979, and it's the story of triplet brothers who have grown up in a boys' home, and when the new government comes to power, they decide that this home and others like it in Britain need to be closed down, and the remaining children in the home released into the community. And this is making the community quite nervous. And as the book progresses, we find out why the general public are feeling nervous about the release of these children. So it's partly narrated from the point of view of one of the brothers, who's 13, partly narrated from the point of view of a girl who lives some distance from them with her parents but has never been allowed outside the house, never been allowed to go anywhere other than her own home. And then the third point of view is a government minister called the Minister of Loneliness, who is responsible for overseeing the integration of the children into the community.
Thank you very much. Anuradha, you said you're moving into non-fiction. Do you think this is something you will pursue more in the future, or do you think you will return to fiction?
There was a New York writer, Janet Malcolm, whom I used to love reading, an essayist, and she reflected on the writing by fiction writers as opposed to non-fiction, and she wrote that a non-fiction writer got his house sort of ready-made. It already had the tables and chairs and doors and windows, and he had to come and make sense of it and analyze it, describe it, and whatever. And for a fiction writer, the grind was extremely hard of putting that whole house together, this house in which the book would happen. And I understood this while writing my book of nonfiction, that it was, that the challenges are different, but it's quite relaxing to, to not have this. So it's a different kind of creativity, and I think I'll return to it, of course, later. But I'm working on a novel right now, which will come out after this book of nonfiction, hopefully next year. Yeah.
Thank you. I think as our time's sort of coming towards a close, again, there are likely to be writers, aspiring writers in the audience. So, as to accomplished and experienced writers, is there any special tips you could pass on, or little pieces of advice about?
Show your work to other people, although not too early. Join a writers group, and if there is no writers group that you know of, then start one. As we've said, it is such a solitary act, and I think it's really important to have that collegial support. Take creative risks. If you are thinking one day, why don't I write a novel from the point of view of a bird? Don't listen to that voice that says that's a really stupid idea. Who would want to read that? Try it. You never know where it might take you. I think as children, we take creative risks all the time. We're always telling stories about what of this, what of that, and coming up with these wild, magical ideas. And we tend to lose that as we grow older. So reconnect with that child's voice that allows you to take those kinds of risks.
Yes, first we'll hear quickly from you, Anuradha.
Okay. Well, I agree completely with everything. Really, to find somebody sensitive, critical, and honest to read your work, that's the main thing when you're writing. And I often feel, especially when I'm confronted with people who have read my work, who are literary scholars, they will often find things in it that I've neither intended nor found myself. And I tend to sometimes feel quite foolish before these people. But I feel I have to hold on to this slight. It's a kind of stupidity, but a kind of holding on to whatever made you take risks and not bother as a child. And I think that if you become too afraid and self-aware as a writer of fiction, it can be paralyzing. So, yes, to hold on to that notion of, the not being afraid to the fear is the good thing, actually. When I'm starting a book and I'm really scared and I feel, can I jump off this cliff? Then I know that, if I'm afraid, then it's worth going ahead with.
Thank you very much. We might just have time for a couple of quick questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask our writers about the writing process, about their works, their books, or...
Yeah, just a quick question to Anuradha. I mean, I have two, but the first one would be, how do you come up with the titles of your books? Because they're really interesting, like Earth Spinner, Sleeping on Jupiter, and Atlas of Impossible Longings. Like, how do you come up with these? Do they just, is it a character that inspires you, or is it the plot? What do you do to sort of come up with these unique names? And the second one is, you said that non-fiction is a house that's already built, but it's a little untidy. So you are, just arranging and organizing it. And fiction is where you build the house. So what about a hybrid genre where you're sort of straddling the both, creating a house as well as, arranging it as it happens? So yeah, just these two questions.
I'll answer your second question first, because it immediately made me think of the Truman Capote book called In Cold Blood, which of course is meant to have been hugely also written by Harper Lee, who was the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, and she was a fiction writer. and it's built out of facts. The thing actually happened, but he's written it as really like a very good novel. So this kind of hybrid, of course, when I'm writing a book like All the Lives We Never Lived, because it drew quite a lot from history, I felt that it was mixing the two quite a bit, fiction with history and interweaving the two. So there is no watertight sort of thing between them, wall between them. But when I'm writing a book like the one on the mountains, where I'm really, I might make up some things because I can't resist that. But on the whole, it's based on things I can research and I can hold on to that. So that's what I mean by having the house already there. And about the titles, it's sometimes it comes very smoothly, like The Folded Earth. I remember writing the last sentence and thinking, this is the name of this book. And there was no argument with that. It was immediately. With other books, it's not been that easy because the title is one thing that you do have to get your publisher to agree to. And they do have a say in it because they have to sell the book. Sometimes if you come up with a title that they find completely unsaleable, they will tell you that and they'll tell you think a bit harder. So I have pages and pages of titles, and then I arrive at one where I feel I will die before they take this title away from me. And that's when they find they can't argue anymore and I get that title. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Is maybe time for one more? Down the front here.
Yes, thank you very much for these fascinating readings and views, also about your narrative world as you build it. My question relates to your uses of language. English is a dominant, language that has a whole constellation of meanings behind it, of power play as well. Is there in your creative work any concern with kind of showing other layers of meaning through other words of languages like Maori in New Zealand, one of the official 70 languages in India? How do you build these multiple layers of meaning through heteroglossia, as Bakhtin would put it? Is there any concern for that complexity and multi-layered narrative language in your work?
So in the X-Men's Carnival, as I've said, Tama the magpie is an incredible mimic. And the question that runs through the book is, does he actually understand what he's saying, or is he just copying these sounds? I know what I think, which is that he's a very intelligent bird and he understands exactly what he's saying. But there are a couple of moments in the book where I just like to make a sort of veiled political comment about the place of the Maori language in New Zealand, and that it is experiencing this wonderful renaissance, but there's still kind of disgusting opposition to it. I'm hoping that it will become a compulsory subject for every child in a New Zealand school, but I think that there'll be fights about that. So there's one scene in the book where Tama hears someone on talkback radio ranting about, well, the Maoris want this and they want that, but they didn't even have, technology before the European settlers came. This is quite racist rant. And the talkback host cuts that caller off by saying, kia pai tōra, which is Maori for have a nice day. So Tama picks this up and later kind of parrots it at an opportune moment in the book. And that, I'm not an overtly political writer, but I like to just thread through small little needling commentaries like that to make a point about that kind of issue.
Of course, I do use a lot of, there are many things because of the number of languages in India. I'm a Bengali, so I find it difficult often to write, particularly dialogue, because depending on which character it is, the dialogue comes at me in different languages. Sometimes it comes at me in Hindi, sometimes it comes at me in Bengali or English. And I read other writers like I've seen that in the last novel by Pankaj Mishra called Run and Hide. What he does when there's dialogue is that first the part that the character would have said in Hindi is produced in the English script but in Hindi, and within the same inverted commas then he has the English translation. But I've never opted for that. What I tend to do is if there are things that are untranslatable, then I will either write the dialogue as reported speech or I will just write it in the language and leave it. Because I really feel that when we were growing up and we were reading books in English, there would often be lines of French or German with no translation, and we were simply expected to know French and German. So I thought, okay, whoever gets the Hindi or Bengali will get it, and if they don't, they don't, and I will not put in glossaries or translations for them. But at the same time, I don't want the reader to be confused or punished for not knowing a language. So I try to make it clear in the following sentence what that was kind of saying, although not really translating it fully. So that's
Thank you, Anuradha, and thank you, Catherine, and thank you for all of your experience, sharing your experience and your insights and your knowledge. I'm sure all of us have taken away both an understanding of the creative process as it happens, or as it's gone about by authors of your stature, and how we can perhaps learn ourselves, or get some little insights or pieces of advice. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. We could have carried this conversation on for much longer, I think, and there will be conversations afterwards. But thank you again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And we would like to perhaps show our appreciation with some small mementos for your time and your knowledge. And
Thank you, Matthew, for the wonderful questions.
thank you very much. And thank you for your attendance and attention. Thank you.